5 minutes late. Yeah. Oh. Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. You won't be able to get over again without getting hurt.
This is John with Manu.
That's why all the still people are on the sides. Class. You can do that. Use your other hands. Yeah, of course.
I'm resident right now.
Kidding, that's dirty. Maybe even more.
Oh wow.
This is the same shirt, isn't it? Curly card. This is what I meant. This is it. Yeah. You're showing. They're gonna what? They did what? They're gonna come. This is square or rectangle. I'll let you see it. Come on. I'll be able to. I'll be Larry in his socks and sandals or short. Thank you for all that. I'll be like, is that me? Exactly. Watch it. Yeah. Slow down. Like, is it really that red? I don't know. He's yelling. He's always blood pressure.
I know first thing I would give him for retaliation.
My little point. I asked one of these, so I like to take a shot. Just get this harsh pictures. What do they call it?
You guys promise you'd wear the same shirt to cover that too?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I'm kidding. I like it. Might actually get an actual prize.
You know, yeah, you know, I just like, I don't want to, I mean, quality-wise, not composition-wise. Quality-wise, not composition-wise. I had a lot of something. Our spouses. Crazy town.
So what did? Jay first job.
If you go up there, we'll be in the way. What's that? We'll be in the way. Yeah, that's what you do.
Hallie, that's right, a rare joint appearance from the chairman and vice chairman here. We saw one of these couple months previously, and they've described it to us as a status report. But we also know that they may take the Trump administration to task for not doing enough to protect the country from future election tampering. Of course, the president himself has, as recently as July, been raising questions about whether it was the Russians who tampered with the election, or who were trying to tamper with the election. Maybe it was another country, he suggested. The sense here from this committee likely to concur with what the intelligence community has had to say about it, which is that it was specifically the Russians. And there's a lot of concern about what that will mean for future elections. The results and events of 2016 aside, Virginia, Mark Warner's home state, of course, has an election for governor coming up, and there's a sense that many, if not all states, are unprepared to deal with this in the future. So we're also going to talk, hopefully, a little bit about social media companies and the role that those platforms may have played in Russian efforts to tamper with the election. And of course, we're learning some more new details today about which states were geo-targeted by this Russian group. We know that about $150,000 was spent on the ads that were turned over to, and then, of course, behind me you're just seeing a 2-minute warning, so it looks like we're going to see Senators Burr and Warner here in just a couple of minutes. But those states included some major swing states and some states that, you know, were critical to the president's victory: Wisconsin, Michigan, but also Florida, Ohio, Georgia, as well as some states that were not swing states in the election: California, New York, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama. So this was spread across, and there was also some suggestion that it may have been related to events not specifically related to going to the polls on election day, that it was designed potentially to simply inflame tensions across the board. There were some ads in states where there were incidents of police shooting African Americans, for example. We know that the Black Lives Matter movement was a part of what seems to be the strategy here. So tech companies very closely watching this news conference today. Twitter, Facebook, Google, of course, in the spotlight, expected to testify in an open session at some point soon. So all of those questions swirling here. Again, a progress report and update on this critical investigation into Russian meddling in the election. Allie.
They're on their way. They're on board of the train.
Right.
Did she say that?
I think that's right, Hallie, and this is a potentially different concern than what we may have experienced in 2016. Obviously, these investigations are still ongoing. We're waiting for conclusions about what was successful, what worked, and what didn't. But obviously, there's always, the more time that goes by, the more opportunities that the Russians or other foreign entities have to try things like this, the more they could potentially learn. And so there's a lot of concern among senators that state systems are simply not up to snuff, as some of them are moving into different ways of counting votes or are using different types of machines. Are those machines vulnerable? And what kind of responsibility does the federal government have in keeping those elections safe? There's some civil liberties and states' rights concerns as well that have been raised by states who don't want the federal government, for example, to come in and set standards or control their vote counting. So I think there's a lot of concern about, okay, how do we make sure that each individual state, which has its own Secretary of State, Board of Elections way of doing things, is prepared and ready to handle a potential attack from a foreign entity as we go into this Virginia election is a bit of an outlier, but 2018 midterm elections will take place across the country. So there are some states that are better prepared than others, quite frankly, and I think there are some questions from the senators about just what the Department of Homeland Security is doing in preparation for it. So we just got a 1-minute warning, I think. I'm not sure that 2-minute warning was quite on point previously. So we can keep chatting. This is a very rare situation, but I do think it's important in that, and there's this area of wording here that I think you may see if our shot goes a little sideways. This is investigation update. So they say they've had 150 plus people interviewed already. 250 hours of interviews, 4,000 pages of transcripts. Now, they also say there are 11 open hearings. I don't recall having attended 11 open hearings, so that may suggest something about what we're going to see in the future. They also say 100,000 pages of documents read. There's 80 plus copies of War and Peace. I think that must be that if you put 80 copies of War and Peace on top of each other, you will end up with 100,000 pages. So I don't think I've made it all the way through War and Peace once myself. Maybe you have. But so I think this gives you a little bit of a sense. They did say that this was going to be a progress report of sorts on where they are in this investigation. So I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of the scope of what we may see here. And I'm going to sit down because they are pushing the door.
Hello. How's everybody today? Thank you for being here. It's a busy day around the country. Mark and I recognize the tragedy of Nevada this week, and at this point I'm glad to say that it doesn't seem to have a terrorism nexus. That's not always the outcome, but our hearts and our prayers go out to all the individuals who were affected, both directly and indirectly, and can assure you that from an intelligence committee standpoint and the agencies, they're providing as many assets to local law enforcement and to those people that are tasked with investigation of this unbelievable act. So we're here to update you and the American people about the investigation into Russia's meddling in the 2016 election. When we started this investigation on 23 January of this year, we had a very clear focus. We were focused on an evaluation of the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment of Russia's involvement in our 2016 election. Additionally, the investigation was to look into any collusion by either campaign during the 2016 elections. The third piece was an assessment of the ongoing Russian active measures, including information and influence campaigns that may still exist and may be ongoing. The investigation started with those three buckets of interest. Now we're over 100 interviews later, which translates to 250 plus hours of interviews, almost 4,000 pages of transcripts, almost 100,000 pages of documents reviewed by our staff and some by members. It includes highly classified intelligence reporting. It includes emails, campaign documents, and technical cyber analysis products. The committee has held 11 open hearings this calendar year that have touched on Russia's interference in U.S. elections. I can say that our dedicated Russia investigative staff have literally worked 6 to 7 hours a day since 23 January to get us to the point we are today.
6 to 7 days a week.
6 to 7 days a week, excuse me. So far, in the interview process, we have interviewed everybody who had a hand or a voice into the creation of the Intelligence Community Assessment. We have spent 9 times the amount of time that the community spent putting the ICDA together, reviewing the ICA, and reviewing all the supporting documents that went in it. But in addition to that, the things that were thrown on the cutting room floor that they might not have found appropriate for the ICA itself, but we may have found of relevance to our investigation. We have interviewed every official of the Obama administration to fully understand what they saw, what clarity and transparency they had into Russia involvement, and more importantly, what they did or did not do and what drove those actions. Again, I'm reminded that we will come out with a finding at some point, and part of that hopefully will be recommendations as to changes we need to make. So we've tried to think as thoroughly through this as we can. We have interviewed literally individuals from around the world. So for those of you that choose to stake out when the next witness is coming, there's some that have snuck through because you don't know who they are. Now, it's safe to say that the inquiry has expanded slightly. Initial interviews and document review generated hundreds of additional requests on our part for information, It identified many leads that expanded our initial inquiry. The volume of work done by the staff has prepared the committee to look at some areas of our investigation that we hope will very soon reach some definite conclusion, but we're not there yet. We're not ready to close them. One of those areas is the ICA itself. Given that we have interviewed everybody who had a hand in the ICA, I think there is general consensus among members and staff that we trust the conclusions of the ICA, but we don't close our consideration of it in the unlikelihood that we find additional information through the completion of our investigation. The Obama administration's response to Russian interference. As I said, we have interviewed every person within the administration. They have volunteered and they have been unbelievably cooperative to come in and share everything they knew, and in most cases were interviewed for over 2 hours. The meeting at the Mayflower. Let me be specific. These are not issues that are closed. We have not come to any final conclusions. We have interviewed 7 individuals that attended the Mayflower event. The testimony from all 7 were consistent with each other, but we understand that with the current investigation open, there may be additional information we find that pulling that thread may give us some additional insight that we don't see today. Changes to the platform committee. And again, I'm addressing some things that have been written by you in this room, and they may not have been on our chart, but we felt that we had to dig deeply into them. We have, the committee staff has interviewed every person involved in the drafting of the campaign platform. Campaign staff was attempting to implement what they believed to be guidance, to be strong, to be a strong ally in Ukraine, but also leave the door open for better relations with Russia. I'm giving you the feedback we got from the individuals who were in the room making the decisions. Again, not closed, open for the continuation. The last one I want to cover is the Comey memos. This topic has been hotly debated, and the committee is satisfied that our involvement with this issue has reached a logical end as it relates to the Russia investigation. Now again, this is not something that we've closed, but we have exhausted every person that we can talk to get information that's pertinent to us relative to the Russia investigation. Questions that you might have surrounding Comey's firing are better answered by the General Counsel or by the Justice Department, not the Select Committee of Intelligence in the United States Senate. There are concerns that we continue to pursue. Collusion. The committee continues to look into all evidence to see if there was any hint of collusion. Now, I'm not going to even discuss initial findings because we haven't any. We've got a tremendous amount of documents still to go through. And just to put in perspective, I said we've done over 100 interviews, over 250 hours. We currently have booked, for the balance of this month, 25 additional interviews. That may not end up being the total, but as of today, there are 25 individuals booked to meet with our staffs before the end of this month alone pertaining to the Russian investigation. We have more work to do as it relates to collusion, but we're developing a clearer picture of what happened. What I will confirm is that the Russian intelligence service is determined, clever, and I recommend that every campaign and every election official take this very seriously as we move into this November's election and as we move into preparation for the 2018 election. I'm going to ask the Vice Chairman to cover the other areas that we're in the process of pursuing.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I want to say at the outset again, I'm very proud of this committee. I'm proud of the way the committee has acted. I'm proud of our staff and the enormous amount of work they've done. I know the Chairman and I see many of you daily in the hallways, and know that this feels like it's taking a long time. It is taking a long time. But getting it right and getting all the facts is what we owe the American people. And as we've seen, for example, stories that emerged in the late summer around Mr. Trump Jr.'s meeting, or the possibilities of a Trump Tower in Moscow. Chairman and I would love to find ways to close things down, but we also still see strains and threads that we need to continue to pursue. I want to touch on two subjects. The first is, echoing what Richard's already said, the Russian active measures efforts did not end on Election Day 2016. They were not only geared at the United States of America. We have seen Russian active measures take place in France. We've seen concerns raised in the Netherlands. We've seen concerns raised in Germany. And we need to be on guard. One of the things that is particularly troubling to both of us is the fact that it's become evident that 21 states' electoral systems were not all penetrated, but there was at least trying to open the door in these 21 states. It has been very disappointing to me, and I believe the chairman as well, that it took 11 months for the Department of Homeland Security to reveal those 21 states, and still don't know why exactly last Friday was the date they chose to reveal that information, but still believe there needs to be a more aggressive whole-of-government approach in terms of protecting our electoral system. Remember, to make a change, even in a national election, doesn't require penetration into 50 states, arguably. And states like the chairman's and mine could be key. You could pick 2 or 3 states in 2 or 3 jurisdictions and alter an election. And I believe in a state like mine, where in Virginia and New Jersey, in 34 days, we have elections. I'm glad to see the DHS has said they are going to up their game and particularly help those states with elections that are happening this year. But we need to make sure that there is a organized, again, whole-of-government approach. I know in Virginia, for example, even before we discovered that we were one of the 21 states, I think the state electoral board, in an abundance of caution, decertified one set of machines that were touch screens that didn't have kind of a paper ballot or a paper trail to this. One of the things we wanted to emphasize with this briefing, that this is an ongoing concern, and that if states don't proactively move forward, very shortly we'll be getting into primary seasons early on in 2018, and this is an ongoing challenge. And again, I'd point out, even after last week, Wisconsin, Texas, and California still have some lack of clarity about whether the appropriate individuals were notified. I also want to raise an issue that the chairman and I have been working jointly on as well, and that is the Russians' use of social media platforms. Social media platforms that increasingly the vast majority of us turn to for information, for news, in a way that is very different. If you look, for example, in the realm of political advertising, we've seen a over 700% increase in the use of digital political advertising between 2012 and 2016. The expectation is that may double or triple again in terms of the next election cycle because of the ability to so target voters. I was concerned at first that some of these social media platform companies did not take this threat seriously enough. I believe they are recognizing that threat now. They have provided us with information. We think it's important that the 3 companies that we've invited, Google, Twitter, and Facebook, will appear in a public hearing so that Americans can again hear both about how we're going to protect, I would argue, three areas. One, making sure that if you see an ad that appears on a social media site, that Americans can know whether the source of that ad was generated by foreign entities. Two, to make sure that if you see a story that is trending and becoming more popular, whether that trending is because a series of Americans are liking that story or liking that particular page, or that's generated by real individuals, or whether that's generated by bots, or in some cases it may be falsely identified accounts. For example, Facebook has indicated between 30 and 50,000 such accounts were taken down in France because due to Russian interference. And third, just the notion that both of us have been in politics a long time. If you have somebody running an ad for you, against you, you ought to be able to go down and take at least a look at that content, the same way that if ads are run for or against you on TV, radio, or newsprint, you can at least get a look at that content. This is an ongoing process, but we're seeing increasing levels of cooperation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the chairman and be happy to take questions.
Let me just say that many of you have asked us, are we going to release the Facebook ads? We don't release documents provided to our committee, period. Let me say it again. The Senate Intelligence Committee does not release documents provided by witnesses, companies, whatever the classification. It's not a practice that we're going to get into. Clearly, if any of the social media platforms would like to do that, we're fine with them doing it, because we've already got scheduled an open hearing because we believe the American people deserve to hear firsthand. And just to remind people, on October the 25th, we will have another open hearing, number 12, with Michael Cohen. On November 1st, we have invited the social media companies that Mark mentioned to be our guest at an open hearing, and we feel confident that they will take us up on it. As it relates to the Steele dossier, unfortunately, the committee has hit a wall. We have on several occasions made attempts to contact Mr. Steele, to meet with Mr. Steele, to include personally the vice chairman and myself as two individuals making that connection. Those offers have gone unaccepted. The committee cannot really decide the credibility of the dossier without understanding things like who paid for it, who are your sources and subsources. We're investigating a very expansive Russian network of interference in U.S. elections. And though we have been incredibly enlightened at our ability to rebuild backwards the Steele dossier up to a certain date, getting past that point has been somewhat impossible. And I say this because I don't think we're going to find any intelligence products that unlock that key to pre-June of 16. My hope is that Mr. Steele will make a decision to meet with either Mark and I or the committee or both, so that we can hear his side of it, versus for us to depict in our findings what his intent or what his actions were. And I say that to you, but I also say it to Chris Steele. Potential witnesses that we might ask to come in the future. I strongly suggest that you come in and speak with us. If we believe that you have something valuable to bring to the committee, if you don't voluntarily do it, I will assure you today, you will be compelled to do it. I can compel you to come, I can't compel you to talk. But that will be in a very public, done in a very public way if in fact you turn down the private offer. The committee has proven to be balanced, professional, and that we're willing to listen to everybody. Let me say in closing, for those following our investigation in the press, I want you to know that you only see glimpses of the amount of work the committee's done. We're doing much of our work behind closed doors to ensure the privacy and the protection of witnesses and sensitive sources and methods. It's become increasingly clear that the committee has stayed focused on building the foundation to be able to finish our investigation thoroughly and in an accountable way. I'm confident today that when we started, we chose wisely by choosing our professional staff to do this investigation and not to the talking heads all around the country that suggested we couldn't do this unless we went out and hired a whole new group. And I think the numbers here reflect that. Ultimately, we look forward to completing our work and presenting our findings to the public. I can't set a date as to when that will be. Mark can't set a date as to when that can be. We will share with you when we have exhausted every thread of intelligence, every potential witness that can contribute anything to this. I don't, by any stretch of the imagination, tell you that there's been value to everybody we've met with. But if we hadn't met with them, then you would have questioned us as to why we didn't. Now, the truth is, nobody in this room, and Mark and I might be included in it, none of us in this room may know everybody we've met with. We're not going to share who we interview. We're not going to share what we ask, and we're certainly not going to share what they tell us. We're not going to share with you the documents that we got, but when you receive 100,000 documents plus, a large group of that coming from the Trump campaign alone, when you look at the country's most sensitive intelligence products, let me assure you, we're going to get the best view of what happened that anybody could possibly get. At the end of this process, we will be sure that we present to the American people our findings as best we have been able to accumulate them. So with that, I'll be happy to open it for questions. Chad?
Thank you. Have you seen any evidence of a nexus between these Russian Facebook ads with the Trump campaign or with any political candidates?
Chad, we haven't even had our hearing with any of the social media platforms. I think if you look from 10,000 feet, the subject matter of the ads seems to have been to create chaos in every group that they could possibly identify in America. From a standpoint of any involvement, let us have the opportunity to have these folks in, ask them the questions. In many cases, they didn't even take advantage of some of the most technical targeting tools that exist within those social media companies. So I would defer answering your question until we've completed the investigation.
Let me just add that, I believe, and I think you will see that there will be more forensics done by these companies. Again, when we just look at scale, France versus the United States, for example, on one of the platforms, Facebook, in terms of what happened, I think they've got some more work to do, and I'm pleased to say I think they are out doing that work now.
Senator, the president has said repeatedly that any talk of collusion is a hoax. I mean, you've gone through all these documents, you've interviewed all these people. At this point, is the president right? Is this a hoax?
I'm going to let you guys quote the president and ask him questions about what he says. It's not going to be the committee. We're going to a very.
Do you have any evidence to suggest, to rule out that the president knew anything about any of these contacts that occurred between any of his associates and the Russians?
Let me go back and say, because I thought I was pretty clear, that the issue of collusion is still open, that we continue to investigate both intelligence and witnesses, and that we're not in a position where we will come to any type of temporary finding on that until we've completed the process. Casey?
You say that the issue of collusion is still open. Are you pursuing the question of whether there's a link between the ads that appeared on social media sites and the Trump campaign?
Well, let me just say that I'll let Mark address it if he'd like to. If there was any connection, that would be pertinent to our investigation of Russia's influence in the elections. We have had incredible access and cooperation by those social media companies that have been in. Some of them have been interviewed twice. At the end of the day, we'll be prepared to ask the right questions that may answer some of your questions at that open hearing.
But we also have to get the universe first. I was concerned on the front end that the first pass was not a thorough enough pass. For example, I cited the fact that one entity, that the only ads that were produced were those that were paid for in rubles. Obviously, there are various forms of payment. So I think the companies are increasingly understanding that their actions need to match their public statements, that they realize how important it is to maintain the integrity of our democratic process.
Would you call on Facebook to release those ads?
I think at the end of the day, it's important that the public sees these ads.
Chairman Burke, 2 questions. You talked about the level of cooperation that you've gotten from Obama administration officials. Can you characterize the level of cooperation and candor you've seen from Trump campaign officials and those in the Trump orbit?
I can't think of a Trump campaign official that we have asked to come in that has not come in. That's pretty accurate. There's some individuals that may have been involved in the Trump campaign that to this point we might have limited the scope of our questions, but with the full intent of them coming back when we knew a little bit more and they pulled a few more intelligence threads.
And so far, when you compare what they've said to you to the documents that you've reviewed, do you find that they've been truthful by and large?
I don't think that, I think our interviews to this point, outside of the 5 specific areas of buckets that we knew exactly what the universe of people we wanted to talk to, we knew what we were trying to find out, that we're very much in an exploratory mode trying to piece together what people did, where they were, who they talked to. In most cases, we have accessed email records, text messages, phone records voluntarily. Usually when you get something like that voluntarily, somebody's probably going to tell you the truth when they answer the questions. But the reason that we can't definitively answer some of your questions today is we will take everything that our staff has put into transcripts, and we will test that against every piece of intelligence and other interviews that we've done. To suggest that we've done that to everybody thoroughly would be misleading you. So let us go through that process. But I will assure you that if somebody has come in and not been truthful with us, we will catch them on that, and they will come back, and that will be the subject of great intent.
Senator, questions for both of you. Based on the work done so far, what's your assessment of what the Russians did do in 2016, what they're doing now, and what portends for the future?
I would just say, I think there is a large consensus that they hacked into political files, released those files in an effort to influence the election. We think they actively tried to at least test the vulnerabilities of 21 states' electoral systems. And we feel that they used the social media firms both in terms of paid advertising and what I believe is more problematic, but created false accounts and others that would drive interest towards stories or groups. And generally those stories or groups were to sow chaos and drive division in our country. And I think that the pattern that they used in America, they have used in other nations around the world. And I fear sometimes if you add up all they've spent, that was a decent rate of return for them, unfortunately.
Let me add to it if I can. We can certifiably say that no vote totals were affected, that the tallies are accurate, the outcome of the election based upon the count of votes, they did not in any way, shape, or form that we've been able to find alter that. I want to reiterate something that Mark said. You can't walk away from this and believe that Russia is not currently active in trying to create chaos in our election process. I assume that the same tactics that we saw in Montenegro, in France, in Belgium, and in the United States will continue to be tested within our structure of the election process here, Don.
Thank you, Senator. Pivoting off that point, you just noted that Facebook, they say 10 million people saw their ads. There was an information campaign waged against one candidate by the Russians. And of course, they probed 21 states, perhaps more, that we didn't catch. So can you definitively look at the American public, Senator Burr, and say that the election was not influenced in any way by this massive Russian operation?
Well, let me take issue with your premise of your question. Neither Mark or I said that there was a campaign targeted against one. We're looking at both campaigns.
Well, that's what the ICA has said.
The ICA did not look at collusion of the campaigns. The ICA looked at Russian, let me finish, Russian involvement in the election process. We're in agreement with that. We have not come to any determination on collusion or Russia's preferences. If we used solely the social media advertising that we have seen, there's no way that you can look at that and say that that was to help the right side of the ideological chart and not the left, or vice versa. They were indiscriminate. One of the things that's most challenging to this investigation is, with the exception of certain pieces that have already been discussed, it seems that the overall theme of the Russian involvement in the U.S. elections was to create chaos at every level. And I would tell you the fact that we're sitting here 9 months later investigating it, they have been pretty darn successful.
Chairman Burr, how would you rate the administration and the country's response to this in terms of preventing something like this from happening in the future? And how ready are we for Virginia's election and 2018? What more needs to be done?
I'll let Mark address Virginia. But let me just say this. Our role is not to necessarily suggest here are the things we need to do. Our investigation should create a roadmap for committees of the proper jurisdiction to follow, for states to follow. Mark and I made a decision to take the initiative in our authorization bill that we require in our authorization bill that there be a designated person in every state who has a security clearance to be briefed on election issues. We couldn't say Secretary of State because that's not the case in every state, but we felt compelled with what we had learned to make sure that just the fact that somebody wasn't cleared at a high enough level would put a state out there not being notified. So we've made some steps in the right direction. As we see those things that we think it's appropriate for us to do, we will do them. If we see that it's not appropriate for us to do, we will hopefully convey that in a way that presents a roadmap for somebody else.
Are you satisfied that the administration is paying a close enough level of attention to this that they're appropriately concerned?
And I appreciate what you just said. I think you're putting this impetus in our intel bill. I mean, it seemed very strange to me that somehow there was an excuse being given, we can't tell top election official because he or she may not have a high enough clearance. I'm glad to see, as of last Friday, DHS has changed that position. But I do believe we need more, and this is, I would say that, whether it's this administration or any administration, a whole of government approach about protecting our electoral system, but we need a whole of government approach for that matter, maybe a whole of society approach in terms of our cyber vulnerabilities across the board. Came from a hearing this morning where there was pretty uniform consensus that the Equifax breach, where most of our private personal financial information may be in the hands now of rogue elements, that there wasn't appropriate cyber protections there. So this is that this is why I characterize some of this as wild, wild west, this whole realm in cyber. We all need to step up our game.
Senator, has the Russian lawyer who
I'm
We
gonna go
haven't
right
gone
here.
to Trump, has she?
Thank you, I'm gonna go
Coming
right
before
here.
you?
Do you think that this report needs to be done, your conclusion needs to happen before the 2018 election in order to warn people about what can happen next? And where do you think the most work needs to be done?
I'm not going to set an artificial deadline, but I think Mark and I would agree. We've got to make our facts as it relates to Russia's involvement in our election public prior to the primaries getting started in 2018, which means sometime the first year. It's still my aspirational goal to finish the entire investigation this calendar year. Don't think I've changed. But when we started 9 months ago, I saw 3 buckets, and today I talked about 5 or 6. So I didn't dream then what would expand to. I can't predict what witnesses are going to share with us that might lead us in a different direction.
And one of the things that, again, I think the committee has been very good at is, we're going to follow the facts. And we want to do it as quickly as possible, but we want to do it right and follow the facts.
Is the Russian attorney going to come through? The Russian attorney met with Donald Trump Jr. She's offered to come in open committee. Have you reached out to her? Is she one of the 25 on your list?
How do you know we haven't already
I
interviewed?
didn't say you did. I'm asking.
Thank you.
Hi. This is a question for both of you. Is there any progress forward on creating legislation that would create new rules for regulating how political advertising works on these platforms that Republicans have discussed with Democrats? I know that you and Senator Klobuchar are working on that.
Senator Klobuchar and I are working on something, and that would, I believe, be the lightest touch possible. And that light touch would focus on making sure that foreign paid-for advertising doesn't penetrate our political system, and that there was an ability to at least look at the content that appears in political campaigns the same way that, similar to the rules that the rest of media already have. I want to make sure we get, and we're hoping to finish that draft in the coming days. And I can assure you that one of the first people I want to share that with is my chairman, because this ought to be an area where I think there would be broad bipartisan consensus. My hope, at least from some of the comments of some of the companies,
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Maté. You've been listening to Senators Richard Burr and Mark Warner give a briefing on the progress of their probe into alleged Russian meddling in the U.S. election. They said that they interviewed more than 100 people. They've poured over more than 100,000 documents. They said that they're not ready to share their conclusions yet because this probe is ongoing. But they did say that the probe has expanded. They're now looking at the development that has dominated headlines for the last few weeks, which is the alleged Russian use of social media. They said that in regards to the Steele memo, which is this infamous dossier prepared by former British intelligence agent Christopher Steele, they said that they've hit a dead end with that. The Steele memo made a lot of salacious claims about Donald Trump. It said that the Russians have compromising information on him, including lewd sexual behavior inside Russia that they could use possibly to blackmail Donald Trump. The Steele memo has been taken very seriously in the U.S. The senators said that they've hit a wall when it comes to the Steele memo, unable to confirm its claims. They talked about pressuring social media companies, like especially Twitter and Facebook, saying that they're initially disappointed with the results that they turned up when it comes to alleged Russian social media influence, but they said that they hope the companies will continue to cooperate with them. Recently, representatives of Twitter, Facebook, and Google have all come before Congress. Facebook has faced the most heat, and in a moment we're going to be joined by Baynard Woods, who's at the briefing, and Max Blumenthal. And what's interesting about the Facebook story is that initially, when Facebook was asked to investigate allegations of Russian social media accounts, they couldn't find anything. And it only was after prodding from Senator Mark Warner, who we just heard from there, that Facebook came back and said that they have these 3,000, that they've identified these 3,000 social media accounts they've identified 3,000 ads from Russian-linked social media accounts that were used to influence the election. Also, though, they just said this week that most of the ads aired after the election, which would be a strange way to influence its outcome. In terms of alleged hacking of state electoral systems, they said that there's no proof that any votes were changed as a result of alleged hacking. They also didn't outline any proof that there even was Russian hacking of state systems. But what they suggested was, on that angle, that the hackers, whoever they were trying to at least test the vulnerabilities of electoral systems. But that, like almost every single other issue or claim in Russiagate, has not been accompanied with any evidence yet. There have been reports that Russian hackers tried to penetrate state election systems, but already, in fact, in the last week, at least 3 states have said that that's not true. So that's part of a pattern in Russiagate, as we've been covering here extensively on the Real News, that of claims being made about Russia and then the stories slowly and quietly being retracted. We're going to be joined soon again by Max Blumenthal and Baynard Woods, who was at the briefing. And I've got Baynard on with us right now, joining us from the briefing. Baynard, can you hear me? Baynard, can you hear me? We can see you, Baynard. Can you hear me? All right, so Baynard can apparently, we can see Baynard, but he can't. Baynard, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now, Aaron.
All right, thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Your quick takeaways from the briefing we just heard.
I mean, there wasn't a lot except for talking about how thorough the investigation has been. Sorry if you can still hear, it's getting loud in here as everyone is packing up. So they didn't reveal really any new information that we didn't know at all. And although I think that it was interesting when Senator Warner was talking about efforts to working to try to work on Americans' ability to deal with this information better. Sorry, people keep walking past me and I keep having to move my arm here. You there, Aaron?
Yeah.
All right.
It's true. It was interesting to hear them say that they're not ready to reach any conclusions yet. I was struck by them mentioning Germany and France as evidence or as potential evidence of Russian meddling elsewhere, because actually in both Germany and France there was widespread news reports about alleged Russian hacking and disinformation there, but then nothing happened. In Germany nothing happened, and here that was taken as a mystery, as being why nothing happened in Germany with Russian meddling. Maybe it's because nothing actually happened. And with France, there was some hacking of Macron's campaign, but afterwards, the head of French cybersecurity said that actually it could have been anybody, that there's no proof it was Russians.
Or here, I mean, the amount of dark money involved in our elections, I think, also has made it much harder for them to be able to tell where this, I mean, we are being manipulated all of the time to think one way or another or vote one way or another more than in many other places because of the way our election laws work in the first place.
Right. Baynard, stand by. I think we have Max Blumenthal on the line. Max, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm on the line.
Okay, Max, thank you for joining us. So we've just gotten this long-awaited update from the ranking members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senators Richard Burr and Mark Warner. They talked about conducting more than 100 interviews from people all over the world, they said, accessing over 100,000 documents. They talked about the probe expanding now to look at social media and the alleged Russian use of Facebook, especially. And they used the word chaos a lot. I took down some notes. There was Senator Burr talked about the Russian goal being to create chaos at every level, and also saying that you can't walk away from this and not believe that Russia is not trying to create chaos. Your thoughts, Max?
Well, the reason they're using the language of chaos, and we've got a ton of background noise there. I'm going to
ask the control room just to fade down the background noise from the briefing. There we go. Good, so we can hear Max. All right, Max, go ahead.
Sounds like we're in like a Hot Shops cafeteria. Anyway, yeah, the chaos narrative is one of the shabbiest narratives, and it's designed to ascribe intentionality to these supposed Russian Facebook ads, which actually have no clear ideological line. And some of them actually do relate to puppies. There were puppy ads. The puppy is a clear agent of Putin's chaos machine.
Wait, Max, explain that. You're saying that one of the Russian ads was contained a puppy?
It was photographs of puppies. There was another ad that we were told, and I know this will disturb a lot of real news people who are afraid of black women. I guess we're supposed to be afraid of black women if we think that this ad is troubling, but it shows a black woman dry firing a rifle. We haven't seen that ad, but according to the Senate and House Intelligence Committee, through their lackeys in the media, this ad was deployed to spread racial division and chaos in America. I personally am not afraid of black women, and I don't think images of them with guns is divisive, any more than images of white people with guns is divisive. But apparently Russia didn't sufficiently cater to the fears of white people. We have been told that ads supposedly promoting Black Lives Matter events, or not even ads, but fake Facebook accounts, like the one so-called Facebook account, so-called Russian Facebook account, Blacktivist, promoting events in Ferguson and Baltimore that were protesting police violence, were, according to CNN's Dylan Byers, who's one of the channels for the House and Senate Intelligence Committee, that this was an attempt to undermine democracy, which means that, you know, if you protested what happened to Freddie Gray, you're undermining democracy. Then there's the issue of when the ads were deployed and where they were deployed. According to Facebook, 50% of all of these supposedly Russian ads, 56%, appeared after the election. So they had no effect on the election. Hence the kind of chaos narrative, like Russia's just deploying these ads all over the place to spread chaos, and we just don't know what to do in America. They don't have any ideological line, so we're confused, and it's getting chaotic here because otherwise, as Morgan Freeman said, we've been a shining democracy for 241 years.
Just to explain that Max is quoting there from an ad from or a video from the newly formed Committee to Investigate Russia that brings together Hollywood liberals like Rob Reiner and Morgan Freeman with neocons. And Morgan Freeman starred in the advertisement. And Max, to quote Max called it Morgan Freeman's worst role since driving Miss Daisy.
Yeah, and you know, the chaos narrative operates on the premise that American news audiences don't, or social media consumers don't have agency, so they're easily duped. That anything racially related spreads racial division, especially if it promotes black civil rights. It operates on the premise that whatever's left of American democracy is too weak to resist. Something like 3,000 supposedly Russian Facebook ads. And it operates on the premise that these ads were actually taken out by Russian operatives from the Kremlin, from the Federal Security Bureau, or GRU, the military intelligence network. There's no proof of that. Before I get to the question of evidence, it's important to go back to the statistics I was citing that Facebook released. According to Facebook, again, 56% of the ads appeared after the election, and 25% of these 3,000 ads they provided to the Intelligence Committee were never seen by anyone. So at best, we have about 1,000 ads that appeared before the election that were supposedly seen by someone. Now let's stack that up. And and then most of the ads appeared or were directed at social media consumers in non-swing states. So, you could take the swing state ads and stack that up against billions of dollars in advertising from both presidential candidates, and the fact that Hillary Clinton didn't even campaign in Wisconsin, especially, in the critical days. And CNN just dropped another piece. Dylan Byers was on the byline. It was obviously filtered out by the House or Senate Intelligence Committee. And it said that Russia ran Facebook ads specifically targeting Wisconsin and Michigan. Didn't say when, didn't say what the ads were. And, I don't think they could even establish that they were before the election. But, by doing that, and it was clearly done by the Democratic side on the Intelligence Committee, they were trying to explain away Hillary Clinton's defeat. And this is the shabbiest, most pathetic attempt. And Russian Facebook ads was trending on Twitter last night because the Hillary bots were all latching on to this idea that Facebook ads had swung the election for Trump, and not the fact that Hillary Clinton didn't campaign in these two critical states and ran the worst campaign in history. You actually saw her spokesman, Brian Fallon, who was the flack for this historic failure, blaming the Las Vegas massacre on Twitter on Russia because there was a meeting between an NRA official and a Russian official in 2015.
Max, I'll read that tweet. So this is Brian Fallon. He was the national spokesperson for the 2016 Clinton campaign, and he tweets out a link to an article about that meeting that Max just mentioned, and he says the NRA spent $30 million to elect Trump, standing by him after other GOP groups left him. Why? The answer may be in Moscow. So he's suggesting that as other Republicans were abandoning Trump during the campaign, the NRA stood by him, and that is due to possibly to the Kremlin's influence. Again, this is the national spokesperson for Hillary Clinton. Max, we'll come back to you, but I want to go back to Baynard, who's at that Senate briefing. Baynard, you were there with a lot of journalists. What's your impression of their level of credulity when it comes to this, as Max has just been pointing out, a story with a lot of holes in it? What was your impression of how seriously they're taking this issue?
So a wide range of people from the sort of mainstream press that I think generally have a great deal of credulity in most of this narrative and many others, and then people like Corn with Mother Jones, who's definitely very seriously committed to the issue, but takes it in a much different direction of wanting to really wanting to nail down the Trump administration with its attempts to collude with Russia and Russia's attempts to interfere in the election. And so I think it's a strange room, and in general at these, that they're going to call on the front rows with CBS and whatever. And so you're going to get the CBS view in the kinds of questions that are going to be asked.
Baynard, in terms of what we heard today, what to you was new, something that you hadn't heard before when it comes to the progress of this probe?
There really was nothing new at all, except for the strange 80 War and Peace copies of War and Peace on their chart, which I assume is what they're equating the 100,000 documents to, or that Tolstoy was involved.
Wait, Baynard, explain that. There was copies of War and Peace? What do you mean?
Tolstoy was Russian.
On their chart. On their chart, there's a line that says 80 plus copies of War and Peace, which is presumably what the 100,000 documents are. But it's a weird thing to just put on your chart. And yeah, it makes it seem like it's saying that there's some kind of relation between Tolstoy and the current, and Putin.
Oh, I see. So they have enough material to fill 80 copies of War and Peace.
Presumably, though, it just says 80 plus copies of War and Peace on the poster. So that's presumably what they're trying to say. But yeah, it's a sort of odd choice to make there. Could have been Ulysses.
Max Blumenthal?
Well, I just know that Tolstoy was of Russian genetic origin, and anything that's Russian is suspect, genetically speaking. So, and any media that derives from Russia is immediately propaganda. That's kind of the... No, but I actually don't. I didn't see the War on Peace motif, so I can't actually comment. But listening to the questions, I mean, you just heard what I've always called the kind of bootlicking beltway media that trusts their intelligence services even as this story falls apart. I mean, we saw the story about Russian scanning of election machines just fall apart state after state. And, the Huffington Post and a host of other outlets have not corrected their stories yet. They reported that 21 states had their voting machines scanned by Russia.
Max, listen, do you know who else reported that just now? Senator Mark Warner, of the Intelligence Committee. He also made a reference to that same story, as if it was true.
Yeah, I mean, we keep seeing these discredited stories be repeated after they're corrected. There's also the story you mentioned earlier about Emmanuel Macron and Macron leaks. The French Cyber Intelligence Service, basically the French intelligence services said that Russia had nothing to do with that. It could have been anyone, which actually undermines the entire hacking narrative around the DNC, because it was said to be the same APT that hacked Macron's emails. But you see pundits from, Peter Baynard to the New York Times repeat that story again and again, that Emmanuel Macron was hacked by Russian intelligence operatives. And then we'd never heard, as far as I could tell, and maybe Baynard can correct me, no reporter asked Warner or Burr how they knew that Russian operatives were behind these Facebook ads. And that's a question that I don't think they're going to be able to answer. There's almost no means of attributing it. What it appears to be is there may have been a Russian troll farm that was paid by a private client to attract visitors by paying for basically $3 ads on Facebook that revolve sometimes around political issues, but also puppy photos that cater to niche audiences and just generate clicks. And they had nothing to do with any chaos agent deployed by the Kremlin and the FSB. But this can never be established by the Intelligence Committee, and the press just simply doesn't ask.
So because, if that's true, then basically we're going to have had this year-long scandal, this talk of our society being thrown into chaos because of a Russian click farm. And click farms are very common. It's not just coming from Russia.
I would put my money on that.
Yeah. I think you're onto something, Max. Well, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank both my guests, the Real News correspondent Baynard Woods, who was at the Senate briefing, and journalist Max Blumenthal of Alternet's Gray Zone Project. He co-hosts the excellent podcast Moderate Rebels, and you should go check that out. Thank you to you both, and thank you for joining us on The Real News.